The cursor blinked on Iris Vega's phone screen, patient and stupid and entirely unhelpful. She had typed, "Hey," 4 times now. 4 times she had followed it with something inadequate, stared at the result, and deleted it. The first attempt had been too casual. The second, too careful. The third had somehow been both, a linguistic disaster that read like a sympathy card written by someone who had never met a human being. The fourth had autocorrected thinking to throbbing, and she had deleted it so fast she nearly cracked her screen. She was a landscape architect. She could design a rooftop garden for a 12-story building in downtown Chicago. She could calculate drainage gradients in her sleep. She had once talked a zoning board out of rejecting a permit by drawing a diagram on a napkin. She could not, apparently, figure out how to text a man she had known since she was 19 years old. The problem was that every version of the message was a lie. "How are you doing?" pretended she didn't already know the answer. "I've been thinking about you" was true, but sounded like the opening line of a condolence card. "I miss you" was the truest thing she had, and she couldn't send it because the person she missed wasn't quite the same person who would read it. She briefly considered, "Hey, so you're a vampire now, and I have some feelings about that." Decided it lacked subtlety and deleted it. She typed again. "Hey, how are you doing?" She stared at how small it looked. How ordinary. She sent it anyway. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. She watched them pulse like a small digital heartbeat, and something in her chest went tight. "I'm fine." 2 words. She closed her eyes. She knew what "I'm fine" meant in Nate Caro's specific vocabulary. It meant he was not fine, had no intention of discussing it, and would appreciate it if the world could just leave him alone to be not fine, in peace. She had heard him say it through a broken collarbone in college, through a breakup that had wrecked him for months, through the phone call where he'd told her, his voice very steady, that his mother had died. She picked the phone back up, typed, "Can I come see you?" The answer took 11 minutes. She counted. "Yeah, okay." Nate heard her before she knocked. Footsteps in the hallway, the particular rhythm of her walk that he had apparently memorized at some point in the last decade without knowing it. Then her heartbeat, which he hadn't been able to hear before 3 weeks ago, and which now arrived through the door like a drum played in another room. It was faster than resting. She was nervous. He looked at his apartment. He had spent 2 hours trying to make it look normal. The blackout curtains were new, heavy, and obvious. The city had a supplier for them, a company that had been doing decent business since the disclosure, since vampires had become a known fact of the world rather than a folktale. You could order blackout curtains and medical-grade blood delivery and UV filtering window film the way you could order anything else, through an app with a subscription plan. The bureaucracy of being undead was remarkably efficient. The fridge had been cleared of everything except the medical blood bags on the middle shelf, which he had considered hiding in the back behind something, but had decided against because there was nothing to put in front of them. The kitchen counter held a single glass, a pitcher of water he had bought for exactly this purpose, and nothing else. The place looked like a model apartment staged by someone who had heard about human life secondhand. He opened the door. Iris stood in the hallway, her dark hair pulled back, wearing the green jacket she'd had since grad school. She was holding a small paper bag. She looked exactly like herself. She looked like the last 6 months of phone calls that went too long, and dinners where neither of them wanted to be the one to ask for the check. She looked like the question he had been about to ask her before the accident, the one he had rehearsed in his car on the way to her place that night, the one that was now irrelevant in a way that made his chest ache with a pain that had nothing to do with his new biology. "Hey," she said. "Hey." They hugged. Her arms went around him the way they always had, firm and sure, and for a second everything was the same. Then she felt it, the temperature. His skin through his shirt, cooler than it should have been, cooler than anyone's skin should be. She didn't pull away. He felt her hands adjust, her grip tighten slightly, and he understood that she was deciding not to react. He loved her for it. He also hated that she had to make that decision. From his side, the hug was a catastrophe of sensation. Her shampoo, which had always just smelled like coconut, now arrived in layers. The coconut first, then the chemical base underneath, then something warmer, the heat of her scalp, the specific alive smell of her skin. Underneath all of it, her blood, a presence so constant and so loud that it was like standing next to a river and trying to pretend you couldn't hear the water. He pulled back too fast. She noticed. Neither of them mentioned it. "I brought muffins," she said, holding up the bag. "Blueberry, from that place on Halstead." "Thanks," he said, and then stood there holding the bag of muffins he could not eat, in the kitchen of an apartment that no longer contained food, and felt the particular, exquisite absurdity of the moment settle over him like a blanket. He should tell her. He should say, "Iris, I appreciate this, but I can't eat solid food anymore. I subsist entirely on medical-grade blood that arrives every Tuesday in a cooler bag like a meal kit for the damned." But she looked so pleased with herself for bringing them, and he had already used up most of his emotional capacity for the day just opening the door. So he set the muffins on the counter next to the meal kit cancellation notice he still hadn't figured out how to process because the automated system didn't have a drop-down option for "became a vampire," and the closest available selection was dietary restrictions, which felt like an understatement. She sat on his couch. He sat in the chair across from her, a distance that felt wrong and necessary. He poured her water from the pitcher and then stared at the glass for a moment too long because it occurred to him, suddenly and with bizarre intensity, that he didn't remember what water tasted like. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and it was already gone. He had a brief, savage urge to drink it just to check, and didn't, because Soren had explained in clinical detail what happened when a new vampire tried to consume human food, and the word "violently" had been used more than once. "How's the recovery going?" she asked, and the word "recovery" sat between them, doing a lot of work. "Fine," he said. "Soren says I'm adjusting faster than he expected." "Soren?" The doctor, the one who," he gestured vaguely at himself, "the one who turned me, the one who killed me and brought me back, the one whose name I couldn't even remember during the first week because everything was noise and hunger and light that burned." "Right," Iris said. Her jaw shifted, a small tightening he recognized. She was filing something away to be angry about later. "And he checks in?" "Twice a week. Helps with the, you know." He waved his hand again. The hunger, the senses, the fact that his body could now hear her pulse from across the room, and had opinions about it. "The adjustment stuff." A silence. She looked around the apartment, her eyes catching on the blackout curtains, the empty kitchen, the general sense of a life that had been stripped to its operational minimum. Her gaze landed on the meal kit cancellation notice. "Dietary restrictions?" she read. It was the closest option. Something happened to her face, a compression, a tightening around the mouth, the specific expression of a woman fighting very hard not to laugh at something that was not, objectively, funny. She lost the fight. A short, choked sound escaped her, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and the horror in her eyes at her own laughter made it worse, which made him start, and for approximately 4 seconds, they were both laughing in a way that was closer to crying, and that neither of them could have explained to anyone who wasn't in the room. "Are you sleeping?" she asked. "Not really. Don't need to as much. I kind of just sit." He almost smiled. "Turns out there's a lot of night." She laughed, short and a little broken, and the sound of it hit him somewhere behind the ribs. He reached for his guitar without thinking. It was a reflex, the same one he'd had since he was 16. Bad moment, pick up the guitar, play something until the feeling had somewhere to go. His hand hovered over the strings. He could feel the tension in each one, could calculate the exact pressure needed to fret a clean note. And he knew with absolute certainty that his fingers wouldn't obey. They were too strong, too precise in the wrong way, calibrated for a body that could crack a doorknob like an eggshell. The guitar required softness, and softness was the thing he could no longer trust himself to produce. He pulled his hand back, put it in his lap. Iris saw it. She looked away, giving him the privacy of the moment, but he heard her heartbeat change, a skip, a slight acceleration. Grief had a sound, apparently. He hadn't known that before. I should probably go, she said, standing. Let you rest. Or sit. Whatever you do. Yeah, he said. Thanks for coming. And the muffins. She was at the door when she turned back. Nate? Yeah? She opened her mouth, closed it. Whatever she had been about to say retreated behind her teeth, and what came out instead was smaller, safer. I'm glad you're here. He nodded. She left. He sat in the apartment, alone, holding the bag of blueberry muffins. He lifted one to his nose. He could smell the sugar, the butter, the specific tartness of the berries. He could smell the paper bag and the hands of the person who had baked them, and the faint trace of Iris's fingers on the wrapper. He couldn't taste any of it. He put the muffin back in the bag and set it on the counter, next to the pitcher of water he had bought, so he would have something to pour for her, in a kitchen that no longer served any purpose except to remind him of everything he used to be. Iris called Marco from the sidewalk outside Nate's building. The October wind was sharp, and she walked fast, her hands jammed in her jacket pockets, the phone wedged between her shoulder and ear. How's he doing? Marco asked. He had known Nate in college. They'd played intramural soccer together, badly, and had maintained this specific, low-maintenance friendship of men who had once shared a terrible team. He said he's fine. So bad. Bad. A pause. She could hear Marco's kids in the background, the ambient chaos of a house with 2 children under 5. Then his voice again, lower, moved to another room. Iris, you know people are going to talk if you keep going over there. Her jaw tightened. She had been waiting for this, not from Marco specifically, but from someone. Vampires had been part of the public world for over a decade now, since the disclosure, since the treaties and the legislation, and the awkward, ongoing negotiation of what it meant for 2 species to share a society that had been built for one of them. Legally, vampires had rights. Practically, the world was still figuring it out. There were workplace accommodation laws and blood bank programs and anti-discrimination statutes. And there were also forums full of people who used the word turned the way previous generations had used other words they weren't supposed to say anymore. Human-vampire relationships existed. They were legal, protected, unremarkable in policy, and deeply remarked upon in practice. The polite version was concern. The less polite version was something uglier, a suggestion that you were either naive or damaged or harboring some kind of dark fascination. Let them talk. I'm serious. I'm not saying don't be his friend. I'm saying be careful. You know how it is. People see a woman visiting a vampire's apartment and they assume, Marco, I just don't want you to get hurt. He's the one who got hurt, she said, and the sharpness in her voice surprised both of them. She softened it. Sorry. I know you mean well. I'm tired. They talked for another minute, the conversation winding down into the habitual affection of siblings who didn't agree but weren't going to fight about it. She hung up at the corner of her block and stood there, the phone warm in her cold hand. Marco wasn't wrong. Not about the world, anyway. He was wrong about her motivations, or at least she wanted to believe he was. She was going back because Nate was her friend, and he was alone, and his apartment looked like a holding cell, and he'd reached for his guitar and couldn't play it, and the look on his face in that moment had been the quietest, most devastating thing she had ever seen. But underneath that certainty, a smaller, colder question. Was she going back because she cared about Nate, or because she felt guilty? 6 months of dinners, 6 months of almost. She had been working up the nerve. She had been taking her time, the way she took her time with everything, measuring twice and cutting once. And then time had run out in a way neither of them had seen coming. And now the thing she'd been building toward wasn't available anymore. Not in the same way. Maybe not at all. Was this grief or guilt? Was she trying to save something or atone for waiting too long? She didn't have an answer. She walked home in the dark, the wind pushing at her back, and tried not to think about the way he'd pulled away from the hug. Too fast, like she was something that burned. Soren's apartment looked the way a surgeon's apartment should look if the surgeon had been alive for 2 centuries and had never fully committed to the concept of decorating. It was clean, spare, and organized with a precision that bordered on the clinical. The bookshelves were alphabetized. The kitchen was spotless. On the wall above the desk, framed and slightly crooked in a way that suggested it had been hung by someone who cared about the content and not the presentation, was a medical license. Then another. Then another. Nate had counted them once. 14. 14 medical licenses spanning 160 years, each one under a different name, each one representing a version of Soren who had practiced until the lack of aging became conspicuous, and then moved on and started again. 2 centuries of learning the same profession over and over, each time with more knowledge than any human surgeon could accumulate in a single lifetime. The hospital where Nate had been brought after the accident considered Soren the best trauma surgeon in the city. They were probably right. They just didn't know that his advantage was less about talent and more about having had 160 years of 12-hour shifts to get it right. The only personal items were 2 photographs on the mantel. One depicted a woman in clothing that was at least 100 years out of date. The other was older, daguerreotype faded, showing a young man in what looked like a military uniform from a war Nate couldn't identify. The young man had dark hair and a narrow face and an expression of wary, reluctant formality, like he'd been told to sit still and resented the instruction. Nate had never asked about either photograph. There were things about Soren that felt load-bearing, and he wasn't ready to test the structure. Nate sat on the couch, which was more comfortable than it looked, and tried not to notice that he could hear the heartbeat of the woman in the apartment 2 floors down. She was watching television. He could hear the show. It was a cooking competition. A man was explaining, with enormous passion, his technique for searing duck breast. Nate could hear the sizzle of the pan through 2 floors of concrete, and felt a stab of loss so absurd and so specific that he almost mentioned it to Soren. But Soren did not seem like a man who would appreciate the tragedy of never again searing a duck breast, so he kept it to himself. "Tell me about the last 3 days," Soren said. He sat across from Nate in a leather chair, his posture straight and still in the way that old vampires were still. Not rigid, just absent of the small, constant movements that living people made without thinking about it. Nate was still learning that stillness. It came to him in moments, when he forgot to perform humanity, and then he'd catch himself and start fidgeting again, badly, like an actor who'd missed the cue. "I had a visitor," Nate said. "A friend." "Human?" "Yes." "How was the hunger?" Nate's jaw tightened. He hated this part. The clinical inventory of the thing that had taken up residence in his body, the constant low-frequency need that sat behind everything else like a second pulse. "Manageable. I didn't. I mean, I could smell her, obviously, but I didn't." "Tell me what you felt," Soren said, his tone unchanged, patient. The patience of a man who had nowhere to be for the next century. "Specifically." Nate closed his eyes. "Her shampoo first, then her skin. Then underneath that, the blood. I could hear her heartbeat from the door, before she even knocked. When she hugged me, it was..." He paused, searching for the right word for the specific horror of holding someone you cared about and being acutely, physically aware that the most alive thing about them was the thing your body wanted. "Close," he finished. "It was close." "Close to what?" "Close to too much." Soren nodded. "And you maintained distance after that?" "I sat across the room." The confession tasted bitter. She noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. "She'll keep noticing," Soren said. "If she's observant, and it sounds like she is, she'll catalog every distance you put between you, every time you pull away. She'll interpret it, probably incorrectly, at least some of the time." He leaned back slightly. "The hunger for someone specific, someone you have a prior connection to, is more pronounced. You know this." "You mentioned it." Nate's voice was flat. "Affinity, you called it. The person you're most drawn to is often the person your hunger responds to most intensely. It's not a romantic phenomenon, it's physiological. Your body has identified her as significant, and significant means the blood is louder." Nate stared at the neat, orderly bookshelf and felt the particular cruelty of that fact settle into him. The person he wanted to be closest to was the person it was hardest to be near. His biology had turned the woman he'd been falling for into a test of his control, and every time she walked into the room, he was taking an exam he hadn't studied for. "Does it get easier?" he asked. "The hunger, yes," Soren said. "The rest of it depends on what you decide to hold on to." A silence. The cooking show 2 floors down had moved to a judging segment. Someone had oversalted their risotto. Nate could hear the judges discussing it with the gravity of men deciding the fate of nations. He would never oversalt a risotto again. He would never salt anything again. The small, accumulating inventory of losses continued. "If there was someone," he said, not looking at Soren, "before, if you were, I don't know, in the middle of something with someone, is it—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The question was too large and too fragile, and he didn't trust his voice with it. Soren was quiet for a long time. The silence between them was different from the silence between Nate and Iris. This one was inhabited by the maker bond, the strange, unwanted intimacy of being known by the person who had ended your human life and started your immortal one. Soren could feel Nate's distress the way you could feel a change in air pressure. Nate knew he could feel it. He resented it and was grateful for it in roughly equal measure. Neither of them mentioned the legal reality of what had happened, though it lived in the room with them. The Turning Consent Act, passed 6 years after the disclosure, was unambiguous. No human could be turned without their explicit, documented, witnessed consent. The guidelines were specific. A turning authorization had to be filed in advance, signed by the human, countersigned by the turning vampire, and registered with the Bureau of Vampire-Human Affairs. There were waiting periods. There were counseling requirements. There were provisions for next-of-kin notification. The entire system had been built to ensure that no one woke up immortal without having chosen it. Soren had bypassed all of it. A dying man on an operating table, organs failing, no authorization on file, no time to ask. He had made a medical decision that was also, technically, a felony. The Bureau had reviewed the case, as they reviewed all emergency turnings, and had ruled it a justified exception under the Act's medical necessity clause. Soren had not been charged. But the ruling did not erase the fact, and Nate carried it quietly. He was alive because someone had broken the law for him. And the law existed for very good reasons. And both of those things were true at the same time. "It's possible," Soren said finally. "It's not simple, and she would have to choose it, knowing what it means." Choose. The word sat between them, heavy and precise. Not fall into it, not be swept away by it, not surrender to destiny or fate or any of the other words that made it sound like love was something that happened to you, rather than something you built, day by day, with your hands and your honesty and your willingness to be terrified. She would have to choose it. Nate wasn't sure he had the right to let her. Iris arrived at his door on a Tuesday evening with 2 grocery bags and a plan. The plan was simple. She was going to cook dinner. She was going to sit at his counter and chop onions and boil pasta and fill the apartment with the smell of something warm and ordinary. And for one evening, it was going to feel like it used to feel when they cooked together at her place. Back when the hardest thing between them was figuring out who was going to wash the dishes, and neither of them wanted to leave. She had bought the ingredients for his pasta, the one he'd perfected in college, the aglio e olio he made with an amount of garlic that bordered on the combative. She was standing on his doorstep with a bulb of garlic in her grocery bag before the implication caught up with her. Garlic. To a vampire's apartment. She stared at the bag. She could turn around. She could pretend she'd planned to make something else. Or she could ring the bell and deal with it. Because if they couldn't get through a clove of garlic without the whole thing collapsing, they had bigger problems. She rang the bell. Nate opened the door and looked at the bags. "You're cooking?" "I'm cooking your pasta. You're going to sit there and tell me I'm doing it wrong, because I will be." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the place where a smile would go if the muscle memory hadn't gotten rusty. He stepped back to let her in. She unpacked the bags on his counter. Olive oil, spaghetti, red pepper flakes, parsley, and the garlic, which she set down with deliberate nonchalance. Nate looked at it. "Really? Is it actually a thing, the garlic?" No. Okay then. She started peeling. What about the other stuff? Mirrors? Running water? Mirrors are fine. I have a reflection. It's just not great right now because I look like I haven't slept in a month, which is essentially true. He sat on the stool across the counter from her, the same distance as last time but more natural now. Running water, no. Sunlight, yes, so that's fun. Fun, she repeated, and the word was both a joke and not a joke, and the fact that they could sit in that ambiguity felt like progress. She cooked, he directed. More garlic, he said twice, and the oil isn't hot enough, and you're going to overcook the pasta. She told him he was a tyrant. He told her she held the knife wrong. She told him that if he wanted it done his way, he was welcome to take over, knowing full well he wouldn't, and the knowing was part of the joke. He leaned forward on the counter, chin in his hand, watching her work, and she caught herself looking at his forearms. The sleeves of his Henley were pushed up, and his arms were the same arms they'd always been, lean and specific, the forearms of a man who played guitar, and the fact that they could now crack granite didn't change the fact that she had been noticing them for 6 months and had been very carefully not mentioning it. The paleness was new. So was the stillness with which he held himself, a kind of coiled attention that was unsettling, and if she was being honest with herself, in a way she was not yet ready to be honest with him, not entirely unsettling in a bad way. There was something about the focus he carried now, the way the room contracted around him when he was paying attention to something, when he was paying attention to her. She went back to the parsley, aggressively. She was mincing it, her knife moving in quick, efficient strokes, when the blade slipped. A small, sharp intake of breath. A thin line of red across the pad of her index finger. Barely anything. A cut you'd run under the tap and forget about in an hour. Everything stopped. From where Nate sat, the world contracted to a single point. The smell of her blood arrived like a door opening onto a furnace. Not the clinical plastic-wrapped scent of the medical bags in his fridge, but something alive and specific and warm, carrying underneath it the precise chemical signature of Iris, of the person she was, rendered in a language his new body understood with a fluency that terrified him. His vision narrowed. The kitchen, the pasta, the garlic, all of it fell away until the only thing that existed was the small red line on her finger and the pulse that fed it. His hands gripped the edge of the counter. The granite cracked under his fingers, a sharp, splitting sound that broke the silence like a gunshot. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. He held himself in the absolute stillness that Soren had taught him, the emergency stop, the last line of defense between what he wanted and what he would never forgive himself for doing. From where Iris stood, she saw him change. Not physically, not dramatically, but something behind his eyes shifted. A focus so total it was like being looked at by a different species. His hands on the counter, the white knuckles, the crack in the stone, the absence of breath, the complete, terrifying stillness of a man using every ounce of himself to stay exactly where he was. She understood, in that moment, what the hunger actually meant. Not the word, not the concept, not the sanitized version she had read about in articles and heard discussed on the evening news by experts who had never felt it. The real thing. The physical, present, immediate reality that being near her cost him something she could not see and could not help with and could not fix. She turned to the sink, ran her finger under the tap, wrapped it in a paper towel. She did this calmly, or at least her hands were calm, though her heartbeat was doing something she knew he could hear, and she couldn't do anything about that, so she let it be loud. Behind her, the pasta boiled over. Water hissed on the burner. Neither of them moved to fix it. "I'm fine," she said, not turning around. "I know," he said, and his voice was rough, scraped down to something raw. She turned off the burner. She cleaned up the water. She finished the pasta with steady hands while he sat on the stool and breathed, slowly, deliberately, relearning the rhythm of a body that no longer required air, but sometimes needed the ritual of drawing it. They ate. She ate. He sat with her, and they talked about nothing, about Marco's kids, about a project she was working on, a rooftop garden for a hospital. The easy rhythm was gone. In its place was something more careful and more honest. A silence between the words where the real conversation lived. She left early. They both pretended this was normal. At the door, she said, "Same time Thursday?" He hesitated. She watched the hesitation and waited it out, the way she waited out everything, with the specific patience of a woman who had 3 older brothers and had learned early that men would tell you the truth if you just gave them enough silence to find it in. "Yeah," he said. "Thursday." She walked to the elevator. He closed the door. He stood in the kitchen, looking at the cracked counter, and pressed his forehead against the cabinet and breathed her out, slowly, until the apartment smelled only of garlic and olive oil, and the ghost of something he was trying very hard not to ruin. Iris sat in her apartment with a glass of wine and her laptop open to a project file she was not looking at. She was looking at her phone. Not at a text, not at anything new. She was scrolling through old photos, the ones from college and from the 6 months of reconnection that now felt like a different geological era. Nate at the birthday party where they'd found each other again 6 months ago. He was mid-laugh, his head tilted back, holding a drink in one hand and gesturing with the other the way he did when he was telling a story he thought was funnier than it actually was. She remembered the moment. She remembered thinking, with a clarity that had surprised her, "Oh, there you are." Nate in someone's kitchen, sleeves rolled up, cooking. Nate on a bench by the lake, squinting into the sun. Nate at the open mic night, his guitar across his knee, and on his face the expression he only wore when he played, a kind of unself-conscious concentration that was the most honest version of him she had ever seen. She put the phone down, picked up the wine. She wasn't thinking about the hunger. She had processed the hunger. She was a practical person, and she had sat with the reality of it, and she understood what it was and what it wasn't, and she was not going to let it define the terms of this relationship, whatever this relationship was, or might become, or had already failed to be. She was thinking about the pasta, the way his voice had sounded when he'd said more garlic, exactly the same, exactly the person he had always been, sitting in a body that was not the same, giving her instructions for a recipe he could no longer taste. The person was still there. She had known this since the first visit. She knew it the way she knew load-bearing walls from decorative ones, by instinct and training and the specific structural certainty of someone who understood how things were built. But she was also thinking about the counter, the crack, the sound it had made, like something fundamental splitting. His hands, white-knuckled, gripping the edge of a world that was trying to pull him somewhere he refused to go. The question was not whether she could love someone whose body wanted something from her that was not metaphorical. The question was whether that was fair. To him. To be the thing that tested his control every time she walked through the door. To make him fight for something that used to be effortless. The simple act of sitting in a room with her. She finished the wine. She didn't answer the question. She went to bed and dreamed about a kitchen full of garlic and a crack running through the center of a countertop, widening. The school was quiet in the evening. Nate had arranged the visit for 7, well after the last student had gone, because the fluorescent lights were painful enough without adding the sensory assault of 300 teenagers in a confined space. His principal, Dr. Okafor, had been accommodating in the specific, careful way that people were accommodating when they had read the district's turned employee transition guidelines, but had never actually had to use them. The guidelines existed because the law said they had to. The comfort with them would take longer. "We want to make sure the transition back is as smooth as possible," Dr. Okafor said, sitting behind her desk with her hands folded. She spoke slowly, as though Nate might have difficulty with the speed of human conversation, which he didn't. His difficulty was with the fact that her heartbeat was distractingly loud, that her office smelled overwhelmingly of the hand sanitizer on her desk, and that the fluorescent tube above her left shoulder was buzzing at a frequency that felt like a needle behind his right eye. "Night classes are an option," she continued. "The district has a program. We'd need a doctor's note confirming the photosensitivity, and there's some paperwork for the accommodation request." A doctor's note. For vampirism. He imagined Soren, 200 years old, a being who had performed surgery in field hospitals before anesthesia existed, sitting at his immaculate desk and writing in his precise, unhurried hand. "Please excuse Nate Caro from daytime instruction. He is a vampire now and will be for the foreseeable future." He imagined the district clerk receiving this note, filing it in a manila folder, placing the folder in a cabinet alongside allergy accommodations and disability requests, and the sheer, grinding mundanity of being immortal in a world that ran on paperwork. "I'll get the note," he said. He would also need, he had recently discovered, to update his emergency contact information, his health insurance, which no longer covered dental, because the dental plan did not have a category for fangs, which was a sentence he had never expected to think, and which he was going to carry with him for the rest of his extremely long life. And his tax filing status, which the IRS had thoughtfully amended post-disclosure to include a box for "turned" that linked to an 11-page supplementary form about estimated lifespan projections and long-term asset management. He had looked at the form once and closed the laptop. After Dr. Okafor left, giving him the room with a kindness that was slightly worse than indifference, he sat in the music room. His room. 24 chairs in a semicircle, the piano in the corner, the whiteboards covered in his handwriting from 3 weeks ago, the last lesson before the accident. Chord progressions. He had been teaching chord progressions. The irony of that felt like something, but he was too tired to work out what. He picked up his guitar. He had brought it, which felt like either courage or masochism, and at this point the distinction between the two was unclear. He sat in his own chair, the one at the front of the semicircle, and settled the guitar in his lap. His fingers found the frets. The pressure was wrong immediately, too much. The string buzzed, a flat, dead sound that was the guitar equivalent of a wince. He adjusted, pulling back, trying to find the sweet spot between too much and too little, and for a moment he had it, a clean C chord ringing out in the empty room. Then he moved to the next chord, and his index finger pressed too hard, and the note died. He used to play without thinking. That was the thing. The guitar had been the one place where his body and his mind were in complete agreement, where the music came through him rather than from him, and he didn't have to think about pressure or angle or how much force was too much. It was the closest thing to unself-consciousness he had ever known. Now every note was a negotiation. Every chord required the precise calibration of a body that had been built for a different kind of precision. He could crush a steel pipe with these hands. He could not play a clean E minor. He managed 4 bars of something that almost sounded like the song he wanted, and then the high E strings snapped. A sharp, bright sound in the empty room, and then silence. He sat in the silence. Down the hall, the janitor was mopping the gymnasium floor. Nate could hear the slap of the mop, the squeak of the bucket wheels, the man's steady, even heartbeat. He could hear it and he felt the pull, not overwhelming, just present, a gentle, persistent suggestion from a body that had decided it knew what it needed. It would always be there, in every room, with every person, for the rest of a life that now had no expiration date. He set the guitar down. He sat in his chair, in his room, surrounded by the evidence of a life that was still technically his, and he missed it. Not the big things, the small ones, the thoughtlessness of being human, the ability to pick up an instrument and just play, to sit in a room and not hear the building breathing around him, to be hungry and have it mean something as simple as lunch. He replaced the string before he left. It took him 10 minutes, threading the thin wire with fingers that could feel the individual ridges of its winding. He tuned it by ear, which was at least easier now. Small mercies. He locked the music room behind him and walked out into the evening, where the air was cold and smelled of rain and exhaust, and the particular autumn scent of leaves decomposing in gutters. He could smell all of it, every layer, and he wanted to smell none of it. He wanted a nose that worked the way it used to. He wanted a world that was blurry and indistinct and mercifully, blessedly, normal. Iris didn't knock. She used the key he'd given her 2 visits ago, a gesture he had made casually and she had received casually, and which had meant, for both of them, something neither of them was ready to say out loud. She let herself in and found the apartment dark, the blackout curtains drawn, Nate sitting on the couch with no lights on because he didn't need them anymore. "We need to talk," she said, and turned on the lamp. He winced. Not because the light hurt, but because her face in the lamplight was the face of someone who had been thinking too much, and had arrived at the kind of clarity that was usually preceded by several glasses of wine and a long conversation with herself. "You're pulling away," she said. She didn't sit. She stood in the middle of his living room, her jacket still on, her bag still over her shoulder, like she hadn't decided yet whether she was staying. "Every time I come here, you sit a little further away. You don't text me back for hours. You canceled Thursday. You're doing the thing you do." "What thing?" "The thing where you decide what's best for me without asking me what I think. You did it in college when you thought dating Marcus's friend would be a bad idea, and you decided to just not mention that he'd asked about me, and I found out from someone else. You do this. You manage people's choices for them because you think you know better." He stared at her. She was right, which was infuriating, and she was also standing 6 feet from him in a small apartment, and her heartbeat was elevated, and the scent of her was everywhere. "This is different." "How?" "Because in college, the worst-case scenario was a bad date. This is..." He stood up, agitated, and the movement was too fast, inhuman fast, and he saw her register it. The slight widening of her eyes, the half-step back she caught and corrected. He hated it. He hated that she had to correct for him now. "You saw what happened with the knife. You saw the counter." "I saw you handle it." "I barely handled it." "But you did." She took a step closer. He felt every inch of the closing distance in his chest, in his throat, in the specific, screaming awareness of her pulse. "You sat 3 feet from me while I bled into the sink and you didn't move. That's not barely, Nate. That's control." "You don't understand." He turned away from her, facing the blackout curtains, the city he could hear through the glass, 10,000 heartbeats blurred into white noise. "It's not just the hunger. Soren calls it affinity. The person you're most drawn to, the person you..." He stopped. The word he couldn't say was right there, enormous and obvious, and he talked around it the way he'd been talking around it for 6 months. "The person who matters most is the person your hunger responds to most. Your blood is louder than anyone else's. Being near you is the hardest thing I do, every single time." The silence after this was the loudest thing in the room. "And you still let me come over," Iris said. Her voice was quiet, not small. Iris Vega did not do small. But quiet, in the way that a person gets quiet when they've understood something and needs a moment to feel the weight of it. "You still sat there while I cooked. You still gave me a key." "Yeah. That's not a monster, Nate. That's a man trying really hard." He turned around. The frustration in his face was raw, and underneath it, something worse. "I don't want to be trying hard around you. I want to be the person who could just sit next to you and not have to count your heartbeats. I want to be the person who could have asked you what I was going to ask you that night, before..." His voice cracked. He stopped. Started again. "I had a whole speech, in the car, on the way to your place. I was going to tell you that the last 6 months had been the best 6 months I'd had in years, and I was tired of pretending it was just friendship, and could I please take you to dinner, an actual dinner, a date dinner? And I was terrified, and I had the whole thing worked out, and then a truck ran a red light, and now I'm this, and I can't..." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "I can't be that person for you." Iris stood very still. Her heartbeat, which he could hear, which he could always hear, did something complicated. It sped up and then steadied, the way a person's heart does when they receive news they were both expecting and unprepared for. "You were going to ask me out," she said. "That night." "Yes. And now you've decided you don't get to." "It's not the same. I'm not the same." "You're right," she said, and the bluntness of it landed like a slap. "You're not. You're colder, and you can't eat garlic, and you hear things nobody else can hear, and sometimes your hands break granite. And you're also still the person who spent 45 minutes on the phone with me last month, helping me pick a paint color for a wall you've never seen. You're still the person who remembered my mom's birthday. You're still the person who makes that stupid face when you're thinking and doesn't know he's making it." She stepped closer. He held his ground. The distance between them contracted to something that felt like a dare. "You don't get to decide for me what I can handle," she said. "That's what Soren did when he turned you. Someone made a choice about your life without asking. Don't do the same thing to me. The parallel hit him. He saw it land, saw the connection between the thing that had been done to him and the thing he was doing to her, and it was like looking in a mirror and seeing someone else's face. Soren had saved his life. Soren had also taken his choice. They had built an entire law around that distinction, the Turning Consent Act, an entire bureaucracy dedicated to the principle that no one gets to decide what your life looks like without your permission. And here was Nate, doing the same thing with different tools, deciding that Iris was better off without the option of choosing him, wrapping it in concern, calling it protection. And it was the same thing. The same thing. Iris, he said, and her name in his mouth was the sound of a man who had run out of defenses. I need you to stop deciding for both of us, she said. Her voice shook. Not much, but enough. He could hear the tremor, could hear the emotion underneath the steadiness, and it cost him something to hear it, because it meant she was as scared as he was, and she was standing here anyway. If this doesn't work, if it's too hard, if the hunger or the distance or the world is too much, then we figure that out together. But you don't get to make that call alone. Not anymore. She left, not slamming the door, just closing it, quietly, behind her. The latch clicked, a small, precise sound. Nate stood in the middle of his apartment. Her scent was everywhere. Her heartbeat faded down the hallway, growing quieter as she walked to the elevator, and he tracked it the way a drowning man tracks the surface, until the elevator doors closed and she was gone, and the apartment was silent, and the only heartbeat left was the one 2 floors down. The woman with the cooking show, who had moved on to a baking episode, and whose steady, anonymous pulse was the loneliest sound he had ever heard. He went to Soren the next morning. Not at the scheduled time, not for the regular check-in. He showed up at Soren's door at 6 a.m., the sky still dark, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, looking like a man who had not slept, which was technically accurate, though misleading since he didn't need to sleep. Soren opened the door, looked at him, and stepped aside without a word. He was holding a mug of something that smelled like black tea, which Nate found deeply offensive on principle, because it meant some vampires could still enjoy hot beverages, and he, specifically, could not. And the injustice of this had not been adequately addressed in any of the transition literature. They sat in the same chairs, the same clinical apartment, the same 2 photographs on the mantel. Nate's eyes went to the second one, the daguerreotype, the young man in the old military uniform with the dark hair and the narrow face, and the expression of someone who resented being told to sit still. She said I was doing the same thing you did, Nate said, no preamble. Making choices for her, taking away her option. Soren didn't react. He had the composure of old vampires, the kind that came not from effort, but from having outlived the need for unnecessary movement. She's right, he said, and she's wrong. Explain. I made a medical decision with the information I had. You were dying. There was one intervention available. I took it. His voice was even, factual, the voice of a man who had made this calculation before and would make it again, and carried the weight of every instance. You are making an emotional decision based on fear. You're afraid of what happens if she stays and sees the worst of it. You're afraid of what happens if she stays and it changes how she sees you. You're afraid that the person you are now isn't worth what it costs her to be near you. Nate said nothing. These are not the same thing, Soren continued. But from her side, they feel the same. Someone is deciding what her life looks like without consulting her. So what do I do? You let her see all of it. The hunger, the struggle, the ugly parts. The parts you've been managing alone because you think managing them alone is noble. It isn't. It's just lonely. He paused. And then you let her decide. What if she decides it's too much? Then she decides it's too much, and you survive it. That's what we do. A silence. Nate looked at the photographs on the mantel, the woman, the young man. 2 faces from another century, kept on display in an apartment that was otherwise stripped of personal attachment. Who are they? He asked. The thing that happened to Soren's face was so small that anyone who wasn't a vampire would have missed it. A micro-movement around the eyes, the faintest contraction, gone before it fully formed. But Nate was a vampire now, and he saw it. And he understood that he had just watched 200 years of composure slip by a millimeter. "The woman was my wife," Soren said. "She died in 1923, influenza. I was already turned. I could not catch it. I could not give her what I had." The words were precise, controlled, spoken in the tone of someone who had said them before, possibly to himself, in empty rooms. "The man in the other photograph was my son, Emil. He was 29 when that was taken. He was 31 when he was killed, in a war that history has mostly forgotten." 31. Nate felt the number land, his own age, his exact age. Soren met his eyes, and for the first time, the careful distance between them shifted. Not the maker bond, which was always there, a low hum of biological connection that Nate had learned to live with. Something else. Something that had been in the room since the first time Soren had looked at him, and that Nate was only now recognizing. "I made a medical decision," Soren said again. His voice was the same. His eyes were not. "But I should tell you that when I saw you on that table, 31 years old, dying, I saw Emil. I saw my son. And the decision I made was not entirely medical." The room was very quiet. "Does that change things?" Soren asked. It was the first time he had ever asked Nate a question that sounded like he didn't already know the answer. Nate looked at the photograph, at Emil, who had been 31 and had died in a forgotten war, and whose face was not identical to Nate's, but close enough, apparently, to break through 2 centuries of professional detachment in a trauma surgeon who did not break. "No," Nate said, "it doesn't change things. It just means I understand you better." Soren nodded. He picked up his tea. He drank it. And Nate, who would never drink tea again, who would never taste anything again, sat across from a man who had saved him for the wrong reasons, and the right ones at the same time, and felt the maker bond between them settle into something that was no longer resentment or gratitude, but something closer to family, which was messier than either. He left Soren's apartment as the sky was beginning to lighten, the first pale gray pressing against the eastern horizon. He walked fast, keeping to the shadowed side of the street, the approaching dawn a physical pressure against his skin that he was still learning to respect. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He typed, "Can you come over tonight? I need to show you something." The answer came in 30 seconds. No 11-minute wait. No careful deliberation. Just, "I'll be there at 7. When she arrived, the apartment was different. The blood bags were visible in the fridge, not hidden behind the empty shelf he usually pushed in front of them. The blackout curtains in the living room were open to the night sky, the city glittering below. His guitar was out, resting against the couch, the broken string replaced. And Nate was sitting on the couch, not across the room in the chair, not maintaining the careful distance that had defined every visit. He was sitting where she would have to sit next to him, or make a deliberate choice not to. "Hey," she said from the doorway. "Hey," he looked at her. She looked back. Something in the room had changed, a pressure differential, and she felt it the way you feel the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air goes heavy and still and every sound is sharper. "Can you sit?" he said. Not do you want to sit, not make yourself comfortable, just can you? She sat, next to him, close enough that her arm was 6 inches from his, and he could feel the heat of her body like a furnace, and her heartbeat was right there, loud and alive and carrying the specific rhythm of Iris Vega, who was nervous, but here. "I've been managing this alone," he said. "The hunger, the senses, the way everything is different now. I've been managing it because I thought that was the right thing to do. Like if I could handle it by myself, I could keep it from touching you." She listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't analyze or advise or reassure. She just listened, and the quality of her silence was the most generous thing anyone had given him in weeks. "It doesn't work," he said, "because you're the thing I'm managing around. Every time you're in this room, the hunger is louder. Every time you leave, it's quieter, and I hate the quiet more than I hate the noise." He looked down at his hands. I wanted to be the person who showed up at your door with a speech and a dinner reservation. That was the plan. I had the whole thing figured out. And now the plan is gone, and I don't know what to replace it with, because I've never done this before, the being honest part, not the vampire part. The vampire part is new too, but the honesty thing is the one that's actually hard. She almost laughed. Not quite. But the shape of it was there, the slight lift at the corner of her mouth, and he saw it, and it cost him something, the small, specific hope of it. So I'm going to tell you, he said, all of it, what it actually feels like, and then you can decide. He told her. Not the clinical version, not the careful, managed summary he gave when people asked how the adjustment was going. The real version. What the hunger felt like at 3 a.m., when the medical blood was running low and the neighbor's heartbeat was too loud through the wall. What sunlight felt like now, not just dangerous, but wrong. A physical rejection that went deeper than skin. What food smelled like when you could no longer taste it. The cruelty of a sense that had sharpened to the point where he could identify every ingredient in a meal he would never eat. What her blood had smelled like, specifically, in the kitchen, and what it had taken to stay on the stool while every new nerve in his body screamed at him to close the distance. He told her about Soren, the maker bond, the strange, unwanted intimacy of being known by a stranger. The way Soren could feel his distress, and the way that felt like being watched while you slept. The gratitude and the resentment and the way they coexisted without canceling each other out. He told her about the guitar, the string, the calibration, the 4 bars of music that had almost sounded right before everything broke again. He told her all of it, and he didn't perform it. He didn't arrange his face into the appropriate expression of suffering or pitch his voice for maximum emotional impact. He just talked, the way he used to talk to her in college, at 2 a.m., when it was too late for pretense and the truth was easier than a lie. He also told her about the IRS form, the 11-page supplementary document about estimated lifespan projections. The fact that there was a box for turned, but no box for turned against my will by a 200-year-old trauma surgeon who saw his dead son in my face, which seemed like an oversight. The fact that his meal kit subscription still sent him weekly recipe suggestions, and that last Tuesday's had been for a garlic shrimp stir-fry, which he had considered forwarding to her as a cry for help. Iris, who had been listening with the focused intensity of a woman trying very hard not to interrupt, said, "They sent you a garlic shrimp recipe?" With a personalized note, "Nate, we noticed you haven't cooked in a while. Here's something easy to get back in the kitchen." That's the saddest thing you've said tonight, and you've said some extremely sad things tonight. I know. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Did you at least finally cancel it?" I tried. The cancellation form asked for a reason, and the options were too expensive, not enough variety, moving, and other. I clicked other, and it asked me to specify in a text box, and I sat there for 10 minutes trying to figure out how to type, "I am undead and no longer metabolize food," in a way that didn't sound like a joke, and then I closed the laptop. "You still have the subscription." "I still have the subscription." She looked at him, he looked at her, and for the second time since this had started, they laughed. Not the broken, startled laughter from the first visit, but something warmer and more exhausted and more real. The laughter of two people who had been carrying something heavy and had set it down, even if only for a moment, and found that the ground beneath it was not as ruined as they'd feared. When the laughter faded, the apartment was quiet. The city hummed below them. His hands were in his lap and hers were in hers, and the 6 inches between their arms was the entire distance of the question that had been building between them for 6 months and 3 weeks, and an accident, and a death, and a different kind of life. Iris reached over and picked up the guitar. She held it out to him. "Play me something." "I'm bad at it now." "I know. Play me something anyway." He took the guitar. His hands found the frets. The pressure was still wrong, the calibration still off, but he had practiced, alone, in the dark, and he was less wrong than he had been. He played the opening bars of a song they had both known in college, something by a band neither of them listened to anymore, but whose music had been the soundtrack of a specific, irretrievable time when they were young and human and the future was abstract. It was clumsy. The notes were uncertain, some of them buzzing, some of them clean, and the rhythm stuttered in the places where his fingers pressed too hard. It was the most imperfect music he had ever made, and it was also the most honest, because he was playing it for her, and she knew what it cost him, and she had asked for it anyway. She recognized it 3 bars in. She didn't say anything. She shifted on the couch, moving closer, until her arm was against his. The warmth of her against the cool of him. The heartbeat he could hear, right there, so close it was almost a harmony. She stayed. He played until the song was done, badly, all the way through, and when the last note faded, she was still there, her shoulder against his shoulder, her warmth against his cold. And the 6 inches was gone, and what was left was just 2 people on a couch, listening to the echo of a song that had once meant one thing, and now meant something else entirely. She woke up on his couch at 5:45. The apartment was gray with pre-dawn light, the kind that filtered around the edges of the blackout curtains in the bedroom and came in freely through the living room windows he'd left uncovered for her. Nate was across the room, sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. Awake. He had been awake all night. He was watching the light change with the careful attention of someone calculating a margin, tracking the creep of dawn across the floor the way you'd track a tide. She understood immediately. He hadn't slept next to her. He had moved across the room sometime in the night, putting distance between them, not because the hunger had gotten worse, but because he didn't trust himself unconscious. Sleep, for a new vampire, was not the same as human sleep. It was shallower, more permeable, and the body's restraints loosened in ways the conscious mind could not predict. He had chosen distance so she could sleep safely, but he had stayed in the room so she would not wake up alone. The care of it, the specific, calculated tenderness of a man who had measured the distance between safe enough and too far, and had found the exact point where he could be both present and controlled. She felt it in her chest, like a hand pressing against her sternum. "Hey," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "Hey." He didn't move from the floor. "How'd you sleep?" "Good. Your couch is terrible." "It was fine before. I think my standards have shifted along with everything else." She sat up, pushing her hair back. The apartment smelled of night and the fading ghost of the music and something cooler underneath that she was learning to recognize as him. Not cologne, not soap. Just the specific, clean cold of what he was now. "Coffee?" she asked. He almost smiled, the almost smile she had been tracking since the first visit, the one that lived in the space where his real smile used to be and was slowly, incrementally, finding its way back. "I can't drink coffee anymore." "I know. I was asking for me." "You can watch." "That's extremely cruel." "You literally told me last night that you can identify every ingredient in a meal from across a room, and that it's the worst thing about being a vampire. Watching me drink coffee is nothing." "It's not nothing. I can smell it brewing. I can hear the water moving through the grounds. I know exactly what temperature it is and what it would taste like. And I would trade several of my new abilities to have 1 cup." "Which abilities?" He considered. "The hearing. I'd give up the hearing. My neighbor watches cooking competitions at full volume, and I can hear every judge's critique through 2 floors of concrete. Last night it was a soufflé that collapsed, and the man described it as a tragedy of structural integrity, and I had to just sit there and take it." "You would not give up the hearing." "I would give up the hearing for 1 cup of that coffee, and I am not. Being dramatic." "You are always being dramatic. You were dramatic before you were a vampire. The vampirism just gave you better material." She got up. She walked past him to the kitchen, and as she did, she let her hand brush the top of his head, a gesture so brief and so deliberate that it was barely a touch. His hair was cool under her fingers. He went very still, and this time the stillness wasn't the emergency stop, wasn't the white-knuckled restraint of the kitchen. It was the stillness of someone receiving something they hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. She made coffee. He sat at the counter, in the stool, the one with the cracked edge that neither of them had mentioned replacing. She used his kitchen like it was hers, opening cabinets she'd memorized over weeks of visits, finding the mug she always used. He watched her. The specific domesticity of it, the ordinariness. The two of them in a kitchen in the early morning doing something millions of people did every day, and that was, for them, the hardest and most important thing. She sat across from him with her mug. Steam rose between them. His hands were empty on the counter, resting near the crack in the granite, and hers were wrapped around the warm ceramic. She took a sip. He watched. She took another sip, slower, more deliberate, and closed her eyes in exaggerated pleasure. "You're doing that on purpose," he said. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, and smiled into her mug, and it was the first time she had smiled at him like that, the unguarded version, the one with teeth, the one that wasn't being careful, and he thought, "Oh, there you are." "Thursday?" she said. "Thursday," he said. A few days later, Iris sent a text. "There's an open mic night at Rose. Thursday. Starts at 8 p.m. He read it in his apartment, sitting on the couch where she had slept, where the cushion still held the faint impression of her weight and the ghost of her warmth, detectable only to a nose that could parse molecules. "That's evening," he typed back. "I know, I checked." He stared at the screen. She had checked. She had looked up the time and confirmed that it was after dark, and had sent him the information with the specific, practical kindness of a person who understood his constraints and had factored them into her plans without making it a thing. Without pity. Without the careful, deliberate accommodation that Dr. Okafor used, or the worried concern that Marco used, or the clinical patience that Soren used. Just, "I checked. Come." "I'm not ready to play in front of people," he typed. "You don't have to play. You just have to show up." He sat with that. Show up. The simplest possible instruction. The hardest possible thing. He stood outside Rose at 8:10, the streetlights casting orange pools on the wet sidewalk. He could hear the music inside, a guitar and a voice, someone playing something acoustic and earnest. He could hear the audience, the murmur of conversation and laughter and the clink of glasses. He could hear 40 heartbeats, a rhythm section beneath everything else, and among them, one that he had learned to recognize the way a musician learns to recognize a particular instrument in an orchestra. Hers. Steady and slightly fast, the way it always was when she was waiting for something she was not sure would arrive. He could smell the rain and the concrete and someone's cheap beer and the exhaust from the bus that had just passed, and underneath all of it, faint and specific and as persistent as gravity, her. The scent that made everything harder. The scent that was also the reason he was standing here at all, on a sidewalk in October. A man who could hear too much and feel too much, and who had lost the thoughtless ease of the life he'd had before, but who had gained in its place the terrifying, imperfect, completely real possibility of the life he might have next. He walked in. 3 years later, the apartment was theirs. They had found it together, a place that negotiated between his needs and hers, with the practical grace of two people who had spent a long time learning each other's edges. The bedroom had blackout curtains, heavy and complete. The living room had east-facing windows because Iris loved the morning light, and because that room was hers during the hours when the sun owned the world and Nate did not. His guitar sat on a stand by the window. He played again, not the way he used to, but in a new way that he had built, note by note, over months and then years. The calibration was different, the music was different. Iris said it sounded better, by which she meant it sounded like who he was now rather than who he had been. And when he said she was being kind, she said she was a landscape architect, not a music critic, and her opinion didn't count. And then she'd hum the melody for the rest of the evening, which was its own kind of review. 2 mugs in the dish rack, one used, one decorative. A running joke that had started when she'd bought him a mug that said, "World's Best Vampire," and he had put it in the rack and never used it, and she had refused to let him throw it away. His blood bags had a dedicated shelf in the fridge, top right, next to her leftover pad thai. It was evening. She was reading. He was grading papers, because he taught again now. Night classes at the community college. Music theory and introductory guitar for adults who had always wanted to learn. The apartment was quiet in the way that their apartment was quiet, which was not silent, because he could hear the building and the street and the city, but was peaceful, the kind of quiet you earn. Iris put her book down. She said it simply, without build-up, without the careful staging she used for big conversations, without the measured breath she took before difficult things. She said it the way she said things that she had already decided and did not need to rehearse. I want you to turn me. Nate went still. Not the emergency still. Not the white-knuckled, breath-held stillness of a man fighting his own body. A different kind. The stillness of hearing something he had thought about every single day for 3 years. Something he had turned over in the dark, during the hours when she slept and he did not. Something he had never allowed himself to want, because wanting it felt like asking her to sacrifice something he could never give back. He set down his pen. He looked at her. She looked back, her dark eyes steady. The same eyes that had looked at him across a cracked granite counter and a kitchen full of garlic smoke, and had not flinched. Why now? He said. Iris considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She had been considering it for a long time, longer than he knew, turning it the way she turned a design problem, examining it from every angle, testing its load-bearing capacity, making sure the structure would hold. Because I've lived with it, she said. I know what it costs. I know what it takes from you. I've watched you manage it every single day for 3 years, and I know exactly what I'm asking for. She paused. And I'm not afraid of it anymore. I was. I'm not now. He waited. She wasn't finished. I'm not choosing this because I'm scared of what happens if I don't, she said. I'm not choosing it because the math of time keeps me up at night, although it does, and we can talk about that another time. I'm choosing it because this is my life, and I want more of it. With you. On the same terms. On the same terms. Not unequal. Not the mortal who aged while the immortal watched. Not the warm hand and the cool one. The same terms. Partners in the actual, structural sense of the word. Load-bearing. Equal. Built to last. Nate took her hand. His cool, hers warm. The temperature difference that had been there since the first hug, the first visit, the first time she'd sat next to him on this couch, and the 6 inches between them, had been the bravest distance either of them had ever crossed. It was still there. It would be there until it wasn't. You'd lose the mornings, he said quietly. The east-facing windows, the coffee, the Sunday light she loved, the light she sat in while he slept in the dark room. The light that was hers and only hers, and that he could not share. I know, she said. I've thought about it. And the pad thai. She laughed. That's the part you're worried about? I'm worried about all of it, he said, and he was. The hunger she would carry, the senses she would have to learn, the guitar she played badly in the evenings, strumming the chords he'd taught her, that she would have to relearn with hands that were too strong for the strings. Everything he had lost, she was choosing to lose. And everything he had gained, she was choosing to gain, with the full knowledge of someone who had watched the cost up close for 3 years and had not looked away. His hand didn't let go of hers. The evening was quiet. The city hummed. The decision sat between them, not urgent, not demanding an answer tonight. They had time. Not as much as they would have liked, not yet, but enough to hold the question and let it breathe. I'd want Soren to do it, Nate said. His voice was quiet. No one else. It was the first time he had said his maker's name without the faint edge that had lived in it for 3 years. The resentment was gone. Or not gone, but transformed, the way a wound transforms into a scar, and a scar transforms into a thing you carry without thinking about. Soren had saved him. Soren had changed him. Soren was the only person he would trust to do the same for the person he loved. Iris nodded. There would be paperwork. The Turning Consent Act required it. The authorization, the signatures, the waiting period, the counseling sessions. The entire system that had not existed for Nate. The process that had been bypassed on an operating table at 2 a.m, while she was asleep in her apartment, not knowing that the world was changing. This time, every step would be followed. Every box checked. Every form signed in her own hand, by her own choice, with her own name. She picked up her book. He picked up his pen. The evening continued. The two mugs sat in the dish rack, one used and one decorative. The guitar leaned against the wall, waiting. The east-facing windows held the last of the city light, and in the dark bedroom behind them, the blackout curtains hung heavy and still, ready for the morning that would come and the mornings that would follow, each one a little different, each one a little closer to the day when the light in those windows would be something neither of them needed, and the dark would be something they shared.